And yeah, I'm going to start letting folks in. If Lori, you want to start in 15 seconds.
Super. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We're going to start in just a minute. Once we get everyone into the room, I'm Lori Wallach with Rethink Trade at American Economic Liberties Project, and our colleagues are just letting people out of the waiting room, so give us just a minute before we actually start. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just give us a minute so we can get people in the room. I see we seem to have a good set of folks with us. And so I think, well, and more people keep popping in. I think I am going to start. Welcome everyone again. I am Lori Wallach with Rethink Trade at the American Economic Liberties Project. Appreciate you all joining us today for this briefing. We are going to hear from one of Congress's leaders on the digital platform accountability issues, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, and representatives from some of the many businesses who called on the Biden administration to ensure that U.S. trade policies were consistent with, and certainly didn't undermine, the administration's all-of-government competition policy priorities and Congress's many bipartisan bills on digital platform competition. Companies like Yelp, who we're going to hear from today, and scores of others in the Coalition for App Fairness. Some small, some big, a lot of companies, the online sellers in the Responsible Online Commerce Coalition, where we will hear from one of the co-founders, the hundreds of company members of the News Media Alliance and Digital Content Next, the many companies and trade associations involved in the right to repair movement in many different sectors. All these U.S. businesses asked the Biden administration not to replicate several specific Trump-era digital trade proposals. These were terms that were demanded by the largest online platforms that would constrain, if not altogether prohibit, Congress from regulating the big platforms, including, importantly, to combat the anti-competitive practices that are not just a threat to consumers and fair markets, but to small businesses and some not so small, but in comparison to the few world-beating Goliaths of the digital market, everyone is small and needs fair competition policies. The companies did this earlier last year, and some prior to that, as the Googles and Apples and Amazons were trying to weaponize trade agreements to attack other countries' competition policies, policies that were identical to ones here, from App Store fairness to the JCPA, the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, to policies that were simply core antitrust in the digital sector. Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate members, businesses and unions and civil rights groups and consumer groups and faith groups also were advocating to make sure that our trade policies were not going to undermine the digital governance initiatives, more broadly even than the issues the companies were focused on privacy, on AI, on online civil rights. USTR acted to make sure our trade policy was consistent with the Biden administration's all-government competition policy, with their AI executive order, with the president's focus on privacy, and with the scores of bipartisan, widely supported bills in Congress. And to be 100% clear, the policies that these broad sectors of our society were asking not to have replicated were fluky Trump-era anomalies. These were not policies that were in the trade agreement since 2002 that have had e-commerce chapters, US agreements, scores of them. They didn't have these rules. There were 4 particularly pernicious rules. So the administration acted to be consistent with the rest of their policies, and good for them. Their Indo-Pacific Economic Framework rules didn't replicate the Trump-era anomalous rules that only appear in the Trump-era US-Mexico agreement and the US-Japan agreement. These rules don't appear in most other countries' agreements either. The administration then made their new position consistent at the WTO relative to 2019 provisions that the Trump administration had proposed. They did this by simply withdrawing US support from particular versions of the rules. And then the US leaned in and helped make sure that that WTO agreement could be finished. On December 20th, as many of you saw, there was an announcement by the chairs of that negotiation, which is called the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce at the WTO, that they had completed negotiations in line with the pending WTO ministerial in February, and that the US had played a helpful role in accomplishing that. All of that is the good story. The bad news is that the big tech lobbyists who had hoped to actually use the trade space to undermine domestic regulation are furious. They went ballistic, and they are now working hard to try and reverse the administration's move in advance of that WTO summit at the end of February. The main arguments they're making are pretty silly. Number one, they're arguing somehow what the administration did helps China. That is just a silly argument because, in fact, what the US did was reassert the US right to control and regulate data flows for national security or privacy, which is to say the US came off of a position that forbid the US from stopping data flows to China, for instance, of Americans' personal information. Of course, there are many other versions of those rules that the US could support, and the US remains a supporter of an open internet. However, repeatedly, there are attacks that somehow this move would help China and it would hurt small businesses. So without further ado, you're going to hear from some of those businesses, some small, some not so small, who can actually speak for themselves, because typically when big tech lobbyists are trying to speak on behalf of small businesses, it is probably a distraction move. Before we get there, I am honored to be able to introduce Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. She's a Democrat from Illinois, who many of you know as the lead sponsor of the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, the federal privacy bill that gained stunning bipartisan support in the House of Representatives in the 117th Congress. She's been one of Congress's leading figures fighting for platform accountability and to stop big tech abuses as the lead Democrat on the House Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Innovation, Data, and Commerce. Along with Elizabeth Warren, she's led the efforts to alert others in Congress about the big tech interests trying to use trade agreements to undermine domestic regulation. Congresswoman Schakowsky, please.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you. So protecting consumers online is a top priority of mine. It is also of the President of the United States, who referred to that at his last State of the Union. And I am the chief sponsor of legislation that would provide, for the first time in the United States, finally, privacy online and to protect consumers' data online. And that legislation, as Lori mentioned, passed the full committee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we're still working to make sure that privacy online is a given for all Americans. But big tech has other ideas when it comes to international work. Oh, certainly they would not like to see a privacy bill here in the United States, but now they are fast at work to make sure that they are preventing any kind of regulations when they want to go internationally, as they want to do right now in what we call IPAF, the Indo-Pacific economic framework is at work, and they are at work to make sure that they can do everything they want. I'm talking about the biggest of the big tech who have been getting together, talking to people at the administration, drafting language for them to have as they go abroad. And the things that they are talking about are, for example, making sure that they will have full data flow, that they can send the information that they have digitally to other countries, not necessarily those that are even part of the IPAF agreement. They want to have no transparency when it comes to algorithms, when they have and source information. No, they want it all their way, and they don't want any kind of anti-monopoly legislation also to be there. Well, fortunately, we have champions in the Congress, in the Senate, and in the House, and also at the trade representative. Catherine Tai, who has been a real advocate to make sure that the rights of consumers are protected internationally, and that there is no way that we then are unable to act locally. And that's the fear that we have, the harm that the tech companies will do, because they absolutely want the freedom to do what they want. And in fact, say any kind of imposition on shortening their rights would be a violation of trade agreements. And so we want to make sure that we are protecting our rights at home and abroad. And so some of the harms that would be hard for us to pass are privacy legislation. If they get what they want to do, our privacy would be out the window. Would be hard for us to enforce the antitrust laws that we want to pass. It could even be hard to pass civil rights laws in the United States if the big tech has its way around the world. And so we need to fight back. We need to make sure that the legislation that is passed when it comes to trade agreements like IPAF don't reflect what we had with the US-Canada-Mexico trade agreement. And we want to make sure that throughout the world, we are protecting our consumers from the will of big tech to take over everything that they want. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Schakowsky, and for your leadership. We're now going to hear from the actual businesses who are going to be impacted by what these rules are in the global economy and what that means for whether or not we can have strong competition policy domestically, the policies that now are being proposed in the US with bipartisan support. So our first speaker is going to be David Siegel. He is the Vice President for Public Policy at Yelp, which is a company many of us are familiar with. Yelp is in a bigger coalition, the Coalition for App Fairness, that has had hands-on experience in trying to deal with some of the monopoly behaviors in markets around the world of the US tech giants. David is well known as the former executive director of Demand Progress, but he also had a long life as an elected official in Rhode Island. He was both a city councilor in Providence, and he's a former Rhode Island House member. David Siegel, please.
Thanks very much, Lori. Let me add one quick correction. Is we're not actually members of the Coalition for App Fairness. We do a lot of work in conjunction with them, but we're not a member as such. So thank you very much. So Yelp owns and operates a local search website, mobile website, and related apps that enable users to share and discover information about their communities. And we help users find the best local businesses across a variety of different categories and allow businesses to engage with their customers. Our apps are present on tens of millions of devices worldwide, and our users have written more than 265 million reviews of local businesses. That said, Yelp has had firsthand experience with the consumer and competitive harms that result when dominant platforms engage in behaviors that significantly weaken or even eliminate their competitors. In our case, most prominently, Google search having been leveraged to self-preference Google's own local search service above those of rivals and potential rivals. And as such, Yelp applauds the Biden team's withdrawal of the so-called non-discriminatory treatment of digital products language the big tech interests had persuaded the previous administration to propose in international trade deals. And in fact, in early 2023, we and a variety of other companies requested that the administration do exactly this. Withdrawing this language preserves the space for pro-competition policies that are being considered in Congress, at American regulatory agencies, and by relevant authorities throughout the whole world. And Yelp is engaged all across the globe to try to ensure that markets are structured in ways that create a level playing field for smaller and mid-sized firms, and ensure that the biggest players, many of which have become dominant through the use of anti-competitive means, cannot use their size and power to unfairly lock out potential rivals. And just to name a few, we're in ongoing engagement with regulators and policymakers in Europe and in the UK and in Turkey, and of course in the US on these topics. For instance, as Europe proceeds with the implementation of the Digital Markets Act, and the UK Parliament moves forward with the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill. Yelp, of course, supports non-discrimination rules that would forbid countries from implementing protectionist laws that explicitly treat digital products and services differently based on where they are produced or on the nationality of their owner, or with the predominant intent of discrimination. But we strongly oppose language that categorizes policies as illegal trade barriers just because they could have a greater impact on dominant platforms, or that similarly target anti-monopoly policies that appropriately only apply to the largest and most powerful digital gatekeepers. Neutral laws that are designed to combat anti-competitive behavior by platforms will necessarily target those firms that have the power to engage in such behavior, larger firms with market power. And that's because they have market power, not because of where they're from. In so doing, those laws will create a more competitive landscape with broad benefits, including to American companies and American consumers. The big tech lobby has not been shy in claiming that various competition policies around the world are illegal trade barriers. But as more and more everyday people and business owners and regulators and policymakers come to recognize that we've allowed economic power to become far too concentrated, we simply cannot let the biggest players use trade agreements as an end run around domestic competition policies. Thank you, Lori.
David, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Amanda Lewis. Amanda is the co-founder and the director of U.S. competition policy for the Responsible Online Commerce Coalition. She's going to explain what that is. It's an exciting organization. Previously, she worked as an attorney at the Federal Trade Bureau of at the FTC's Bureau of Competition. Pardon me for the mistake, Yelp, on your coalition membership. And she was detailed to the House Subcommittee on Antitrust during the oversight hearings and the authorship of the large report on an investigation of competition in digital markets. She's worked in law firms and is currently in her capacity as the representative of ROC, going to speak to us about her member company's interests. Amanda, please.
Lori, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in today's briefing, and thank you also to Representative Schakowsky for her leadership on this issue and advocacy on behalf of businesses of all sizes and consumers as well. So as you mentioned, I'm here to speak on behalf of the Responsible Online Commerce Coalition. And ROC is a broad coalition of businesses who rely on Amazon or other online platforms to reach their customers. The coalition really just seeks to ensure fair play for all businesses that operate in online commerce. ROC strongly supports the Biden administration and Ambassador Tai's recent actions, including the withdrawal of digital trade language that would have undermined critical efforts to address big tech's monopoly power. And those efforts were referenced by Lori in the beginning of the call and throughout, and our members are really just very grateful for the Biden administration's work here. I think also, as David mentioned, where our interests lie, and from these businesses' interests, there are efforts in other countries in Europe, for example, with the Digital Markets Act, and ROC has many members that are US companies, and then also members who either are based in Europe or operate in Europe, because a lot of these digital companies, of course, are operating in markets across the world. Again, from Europe to Japan to Australia to Canada. So the efforts by big tech to have language in trade agreements that would undermine efforts by other countries to address the big tech gatekeepers' monopoly power are something that our members are very concerned about. So again, for example, the DMA in Europe represents a progress in efforts to address the abuse of monopoly power by the platforms. But the non-discrimination language that the US recently withdrew for the WTO e-commerce JSI, that would have posed a serious threat to the robust implementation and enforcement of the DMA. And that's also true for similar efforts under consideration by other countries, some of the countries that I mentioned. So all of this is part of the reason why in November, ROC joined a diverse group of tech companies in writing a letter to President Biden, Ambassador Tai, thanking the administration for their actions to withdraw the extremely problematic non-discrimination language. And in that letter, it explicitly states that language risks serving the interests of several big tech companies to the detriment of everyone else. So I'll say that again. That language risks serving the interests of several of the big tech monopolists to the detriment of everyone else. And that should be of concern to everyone on this call. And I think it's why this issue has really drawn a lot of attention, despite the fact that the big tech companies would have liked this to be under the radar as a backdoor way to evade accountability and competition, regulation, and enforcement. So ROC members have taken note. We see what the big tech companies are trying to do, as other folks on this call have said. And I think there is a bit of a false narrative that I have seen in some of the coverage of this issue, that businesses, the entire business community, is actually in favor of that language that was withdrawn. And it's only sort of civil society groups and more progressive groups that actually wanted that language withdrawn. And that's part of the reason I'm here, is to set the record straight that is absolutely not true. There are many businesses that really and truly applaud and appreciate the efforts of the administration to get this right. And we are here to support the administration on this, and our members just urge and hope that the Biden administration and Ambassador Tai will stay the course to do what's right for all American businesses, regardless of how big they are and how many lobbyists they can pay for and how many ads they can buy. And so I'm happy to be here and happy to answer any questions.
Amanda, thank you very much. And that is our perfect transition to the next part of our call, which will be question and answers with our speakers. I want to say one just more small thing to get everyone up to speed. What specifically has caused this big tech lobbyist meltdown and the set of fallacious arguments that are being hurled with extreme velocity is the US had in the spring in its positions at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework not replicated the USMCA, the NAFTA replacement rules that the Trump administration had included in that agreement, anomalous rules, and then in the same year, 2019, tabled as a US proposal at the WTO, these 4 specific provisions, one of which is this competition policy threat that has animated so many American businesses. That language, the administration announced, given no other country supported it, was not going to be already included in the IPEF. They decided that. And at the WTO, they announced in October that they were withdrawing that. Also to try and actually take just a random orphan provision out of the way so the deal could get finished. They also announced US initials are being pulled off of the versions of language, of which there are many versions. The US has not settled on what other version it's going to join or if it's going to offer new language, but that the US would leave these versions that had very little support, that were extreme versions of the rules that big tech wanted, that again were only in USMCA. They were not in other US agreements. So with that, I'm going to open to questions. I'm going to ask, please, reporters, if you could use the hand raise signal, unmute yourselves, take your hands up so I can pick on people to ask questions from any of our panelists. And Congressman Schakowsky, if you are still there, if I can have you open your screen so we may see you. And I'm first going to call on Bob Kuttner with the American Prospect.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Congressman Schakowsky. You know, the subtext to this story is that either other agencies or the White House, in effect, is undercutting both USTR and President Biden's own position. Do we know who at the White House is in charge of this, or is this just a taffy pull?
Who would like to speak to that hot potato?
Yeah, so I was gonna turn that over to you, Lori. Because I don't know. I unfortunately don't have any more information on that aspect of this than you all do.
The only thing I think I could shed any light on it is it has been no secret that in the initial process of interagency discussion about what the US position would be going into the IPEF negotiations, which that process preceded the tabling of language on this issue in February of 2023, the digital trade text of IPEF, there were different views in different agencies. And there have been grumblings from places like the Commerce Department, et cetera, who seem to be more favorably inclined into keeping the old anomalous Trump era provisions. I think that at this point, the big tech lobbyists have tried to find their particular specific allies on Capitol Hill within the administration and have tried to activate them, I will just say, to try to relitigate what was a decision that was well thought out and is very logical as far as trying to make sure that the administration's trade policy doesn't undermine the rest of the administration's policy or undermine and cause a huge fight with what are now bipartisan pacts of senators and House members who unusually are actually united on the notion we need competition policy for big tech. There are a few things they're agreeing with, but these are actually bipartisan bills. So that I think is a little bit of an indication. Anyone else want to jump in?
May I just follow up?
Yes.
So in other administrations, trade policy has been the province of USTR. And if the White House decides that, well, we don't 100% trust USTR to carry this out, then USTR must be reporting to somebody at the White House. Is it just impossible to find out who's in charge?
We look forward to your intrepid reporting,
Ah,
Mr. Kuttner.
thank you,
Sorry,
Wallach.
sorry, I wish I had a clearer answer. May I please call on Hannah? We have lost Congresswoman Schakowsky, unfortunately, because we're slightly over time, but I want to give reporters a chance to speak to our business representatives. Hannah, please.
I hope I didn't scare her off.
Yes, hi, thanks. I just wanted to ask, I think there's been some reference to what the Biden administration has withdrawn now their support on certain things. And I'm curious, I guess, what the people available here today now think that how the administration should move forward, what should the next steps be, where should they come down on these policies going forward, and how do they now move forward on some of these negotiations, or how should they move forward on some of these negotiations?
So I'm happy to speak a little bit on this. It is my understanding that all of the right people are in the room on this now, and so the administration is getting the benefit of the Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, and the Federal Trade Commission, which are agencies that have particular expertise on antitrust and competition law and are involved in bringing involved in litigation against Google, Amazon, potentially soon Apple. So I think I am cautiously optimistic that the right people are in the room and weighing in, and at least from ROC's perspective and from our members' perspective, we would want whatever language is ultimately put forward to have sign off from the heads of both DOJ, Antitrust Division, and the Federal Trade Commission.
I guess I would just add that if folks have not listened to USTR Ty's speech at the Aspen Security Conference at the end of the year, I think she makes a very lucid and clear case of what they think the process is going forward, which to my ear made a lot of sense, which is she more or less says, I need to have Congress be a little bit clearer about what their goals are so that we can make sure that what I as a negotiator am doing is not getting ahead of what our US policy is. You figure out what the proper policy is, and then I'll make sure our trade agreements are consistent. She's gotten a lot of credit in Congress for not doing what some previous USTRs have done, which is using the closed door negotiations to basically preempt Congress's policymaking and use an international binding set of rules to impose policy on Congress. So I think the way that she laid out the construct of the process is correct. With respect to what's going on, at the WTO, they actually announced the partial completion, the completion of the agreement with respect to 13 core provisions on which there was consensus. Whether or not the US announced that the US no longer supported the provisions that the Trump administration tabled in 2019 or not, the WTO had no consensus on issues like data flows, on issues like special secrecy for tech firms with respect to algorithms. And there literally wasn't another country that had joined the US on the non-discrimination rule that the businesses today are focused on. Ironically, even on the data flows rule, the US really was not, the position the US had joined with Singapore and Australia and Japan was extremely controversial, whether or not the US had anything to say about it. And there are other versions of those rules. So what happens in the future at the WTO if they revisit that set of issues, and whether or not we have by then federal privacy law, those are all issues of sequencing, of basically all the agencies involved in Congress figuring out what policy space that we need. However, the notion that somehow the US walked away, in fact, the US was pretty critical in after 6 years of negotiations, there actually being a likely deal on a core set of digital rules at the WTO. So that the reality is contrary to sort of the myth about the US blew up the rule setting. I'm going to close with that and thank our speakers again for their time and participation, and thank all of you for joining us. Thank you very much. Hopefully it has been elucidating to actually hear from some of the businesses who have a stake in this as compared to hearing about those businesses' interests. Thank you all very much. And with that, we conclude.